Today on our DNR segment, we've got Kevin Frailey with us. He is the Section Manager for Education Services with the Department of Natural Resources. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Great to be back, Tim.
We are going to be talking about history. The last time you and I had a chance to talk, we talked about getting kids outside in the outdoors. Yep. But let's talk a little bit about the history of the DNR. 125 years. Now, was Michigan the first one to have a conservation officer out there?
Yep. It's 125 years since Michigan hired the first conservation officer, so that's kind of the celebration of the year. And we were the first to have a CO. You'll see some stuff that there were some COs or game wardens, of course, back then, like a Yellowstone National Park, but that was years later. But for a state to actually establish a position to have a guy go out and check a fish and game stuff, Michigan was 1887, which is amazing. You know, that's only 22 years after the closing of the Civil War.
Exactly right. Which
yeah.
You know, that's when you talk about the history and in schools, and it's just kind of like, wow, that wasn't that much longer after the fact.
Right, right.
Talk to me about what Michigan looked like back then when it comes to conservation.
Michigan was a mess. If you remember your logging history, from 1860 to about 1900, Michigan was just totally wiped out. It was logs from Michigan and timber went all across the country, helped rebuild Chicago after the Chicago fire. So Michigan it's almost like you woke up one morning and there were no trees. It was all stumps, slash fires. The rivers were all screwed up because the logging, of course, stirred up sediment. And it was a really disaster area back in those years.
So what turned the tide then to get us on the right track?
Sportsmen, of course. Way back then, there were sportsmen who became concerned and started establishing clubs, and they lobbied government actually to start doing something. And some of like the forerunner of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was something called the Commission on Fish and Fisheries, created in 1871. They started turning the tide. Of course, Teddy Roosevelt comes in 1901 and totally changes the face of conservation in America. And we really became to have a conservation ethic. Over the next few years. You know, the DNR actually, or Department of Conservation, 1921 established. MUCC, they have an anniversary coming up here, 1937. DU 1937. So then through the 30s and on, a huge legacy there.
Now, the funding for the DNR, predominantly all the money from people buying license. That's what funds the DNR. So if there are less people buying license, that's less money for the DNR, exactly. Which means less officers or less staff.
Exactly. You know, Tim, a lot of your viewers already know that we're funded, just like you said, by sportsman dollars. But most people, if you stop people on the street, and if you ask 9 out of 10 people on the street, they'd probably think their taxes support the department. Right. And a statistic I always like is when you look at the general fund or the tax support that we get as an agency, it boils down to about $1.40 a year for every man, woman, and child in Michigan. I
mean, from fishing to hunting to wildlife and nature to what's being done with a lot of the different parks and state parks out there, really has been a push. And I think that, you know, I would stack Michigan up against any state in the country and say what a beautiful outdoors we have.
We do, and people, you know, have supported over and over. When you think of the initiatives, even going back to bottle bills and some of the park proposals and things over the years that have been on an actual initiative that people could go out and pull the lever on. They've always been great supporters of the outdoors in Michigan, so that's the upside. That's tremendous.
All right, so I'm not a hunter. I'm not going out in the woods. Does it help if I buy a license?
Absolutely. You know, for years I speak to a lot of groups that aren't necessarily hunters and fishermen. You know, I do a lot of teacher education programs and things like that. And I've always said at the end, you know, people always ask you, what can I do? And I'll say, well, go buy a hunting license, go buy a fishing license. They'll say, wait a minute, I
don't even go in the outdoors. What are you talking about?
Yeah, but you know, when you explain then how that, again, the general fund story, that we don't really get any general fund funding, or very little, that they can help support our initiatives by buying those licenses. It makes a difference.